Let's try that again. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Vote for Change Town Hall, hosted by SAC Change Coalition. My name is Ashley Draper, organizer and co-founder of SAC Change, that is sacchange.org, and I'm so excited to get into this panel discussion with you about Prop 20. You may have received your voter guides in the mail, and in a moment, we're going to give you a quick 90-second video giving you just enough time to go and grab it. Before we get started, let's go over some house rules. We are streaming this panel live via Facebook, and we do want your questions. We want your feedback. We want this to be interactive, but we also ask that you are respectful to our panelists and to each other. So please, no foul or disparaging language or comments. Let's keep it clean. Also, if you found this discussion helpful in making your decision on how you're going to vote in this November vote, join us again next week on October 8th when we'll discuss Prop 25. The next voice that you'll hear following the video is our esteemed moderator, Mr. Khaim Moton. With more than 18 years in politics and experience in public policy consulting, we are very lucky to have him. So without further ado, go and grab your voter guides. Please follow along with us, and we'll see you after the video.
Election officials work hard to maintain the integrity, security, and privacy of elections in Sacramento County. Every registered voter in the county will receive a vote-by-mail ballot in the mail. Have you ever wondered what happens to your ballot when you send it in? Returned ballots are received at the elections office where they're processed and counted. Each voter's ballot envelope has a unique barcode that gives you credit for voting. This ensures that each voter can only vote once. Every signed ballot envelope is compared to signatures on file for the voter in our database. If your signature matches, your ballot moves on to the next step. If your signature is challenged, you'll be notified and given instructions on how to correct the issue. The two most common reasons a ballot envelope is challenged are the envelope isn't signed or the signature doesn't match the voter's record. A challenged ballot will be counted once the problem is corrected. You can check the status of your ballot at www.elections.saccounty.net. When voter signatures are verified, ballot envelopes are opened and the ballot is removed, unfolded, and prepared for processing through scanners, which total up the votes. Results are tabulated and released after the polls close on election night. When you vote by mail, you can be assured that your vote counts and that your ballot is both secure and private. If you have any questions, contact the Sacramento County Elections Office or visit us online.
Good evening and welcome to another town hall being brought to you by the SAC Change Coalition. I'm your moderator for this evening. I'm Khaim Moton, and tonight we are going to be discussing Prop 20. And as we get into that, I'd like to bring in our panelists for this evening. First is Miss Alana Mathews, and second, Miss Christi Ketchum. Alana, if you could take a moment and let folks know who you are.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Alana Mathews Arcurio, and I'm an attorney here in Sacramento. I started my career as a deputy district attorney for Sacramento County, and then went on to work as an appointee at the California Energy Commission under Governor Brown. And I am currently working in the California legislature. But more importantly, I am the founder of the Community Justice Collaborative. And that is an organization that works on criminal justice reform as well as reentry issues.
And thank you. And also Miss Christi Ketchum. Christi?
Hello, everybody. My name is Christi Ketchum. I am a native of Sacramento by way of graduating from Clark Atlanta University. I moved back to Sacramento in 2010, and I am the founder of the Sacramento Sister Circle, which is a network of Black women of over 8,500 Black women in the greater Sacramento area. Our pillars are focused on mentoring younger women and girls, the study of Black women, expanding our horizons, doing things that make us feel whole spiritually, mentally, emotionally, also being politically active, which is what I'm doing today, and also being financially aware and educated. And so I'm coming here in that capacity. I have several other jobs, but in lines with what I'm supposed to be doing today, we're going to just keep it at that.
Thank you very much. And as we get into this evening, I do want to start out and just kind of start with the framing, the basic question. What is Proposition 20? By now, folks start to, kind of understand. It's like, well, what's a proposition? That means that it can go before the voters and not have to go to the legislature in many, many instances. But I'd like to start out with you, Alana, and ask you if you could give us a general overview of what Proposition 20 is.
Absolutely. And I think in order to do that effectively, I need to give you a little background on that. So just very quickly, back in 2011, the United States Supreme Court made a ruling that said California's overcrowded prisons was a violation of the Constitution because it constituted cruel and unusual punishment. And they were ordered to reduce it by the equivalent of, let's just say, 30,000 inmates, or 100, and I think it was 35% of the capacity of our prisons. So when that happened at the time, Jerry Brown was the governor, and that was the first thing that happened in that case. Later on that year was the implementation of another significant event, which was Assembly Bill 109. And that went into effect, I believe it was October of 2011. And that basically is what people refer to as realignment. And during that law passed, it transferred the management or supervision of certain felons. So people who were convicted of non-serious, non-violent, non-sexual crimes, it transferred their management and supervision from the state parole system to local governments, local counties. Then the third event that was significant that happened was Prop 47, which was passed in 2014, which my co-panelist Christi worked very hard on. And that was basically converting a number of non-violent offenses from felonies to misdemeanors. I think it was about 500 that were included, but they were mostly shoplifting, bad checks, or drug possession. So that converted it from a misdemeanor, from a felony into a misdemeanor. And then a third in our criminal justice reform, just kind of to show you the backdrop, was in 2016. And that was Prop 57. And that did two significant things. One is it took certain felonies, they were nonviolent felons, who had already served their full sentence of their primary offense. And as long as they had, one, served their full sentence of their primary offense, and they passed the screening for public safety, then they became eligible for parole. Doesn't mean they were automatically released. And what that public safety screening means is that they got good behavior credit. They earned good credits for good behavior. They had educational achievement. So let's say they went and got a degree or some kind of vocation, and then they had some kind of rehabilitative achievement. So once they got that, they were able to be eligible for early release. So that's sort of the backdrop, is that we have this overcrowded, unconstitutional situation in our prisons. We passed criminal justice reform that, one, was able to address that unconstitutional situation, but that also had a more human-centered focus on how we look at criminal justice and how we are treating people who have made bad mistakes, who are criminals, and they're treating that. So what Prop 20 does is that it says it has three goals to address problems that they felt were present in Prop 47, Prop 57, and AB 109. And it does four things specifically. And so I'm going to read this because I don't want to quote it. So let me just pull it up. I like to be factual. So the four things that Prop 20 does is that it classifies certain crimes. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong.
I can do you want me to do the four?
Yeah, you can.
Sure.
So Prop 20 would support a culture of punishment and not care. Prop 20 would add crimes to the list of violent felonies for which early parole is restricted. recategorize certain types of theft and fraud crimes as wobblers, chargeable as misdemeanors or felonies. And I want to touch on that just a bit, because before Prop 47, DAs were able to decide who would be charged as a misdemeanor or a felony, and oftentimes people of color, low-income people, would get charged the felonies as opposed to their white counterparts. So it's important to say that. There's also a require of DNA collection from people found guilty of certain misdemeanors, and then it also, I'm getting it. It's hard to talk about the no. Okay, so and then Prop 20 abuses the experiences of survivors to further criminalize people that will actually take money and resources from trauma recovery services for survivors. And then it would also increase incarceration through the state, which Prop 47 immediately, the incarceration rates went down.
So in that, it does, it does several things. Where I said it changes state law to increase criminal penalties for some theft-related crimes, which you started to describe. It changes how people released from state prison are treated. It makes various changes to Prop 57, like you said, from 2016, and it requires the DNA collection for certain adults convicted of certain crimes. So as we start to kind of go into that, and I want to dive a little deeper into that in Prop 20 in terms of some of the changes that it's making and how it rolls back those previous criminal justice reforms that you talked about. Because as we look at that, if we just go back from the court decision around 2010, you said AB 109 around 2011, Prop 47 in 2014, and then Prop 57 in 2016. So we've only been really kind of dealing with this realignment, so to speak, or as you started to frame it, into like human-centered reform from our correction system, really in totality, only like a couple years.
Not even that. Let me just point out one thing to you. We had Prop 57 in 2016. I believe it was 2017 that Prop 20 was actually filed with the Secretary of State. So, of course, with propositions, you have to have a number of signatures that has to be gathered. And that particular proposition, I won't go into all that background, but there was a lawsuit regarding a number of signatures that had to be achieved. So it's important to note that, unfortunately, this proposition was put forth before there was even time to gather data and statistics to see if this was even needed.
Right.
Because it was passed in 2016, but then they had the proposition already, the proponents of it had already filed it in 2017. But I digress. I just want to say it was actually months, really.
And
well, that's good.
Like I said,
go ahead, Christi. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, Prop 47 was retroactive, so it immediately freed people from these jails that were sitting in these jails because they couldn't make bail, right? And so there has been hundreds of millions of dollars saved. Hundreds of millions of dollars are saved. And that money from Prop 47 actually went to trauma center recovery centers. It went to schools and mental health services. And I'm glad that you said that, Alana, because from the onset of the passage of these bills, the law enforcement community has been completely against any type of reform. It was met with opposition from the gate and continues to do so, as we see as we're working on this proposition now.
And Khaim, clarity. So with Prop 47, I talked about the reforms that it had as far as changing it. But what Christi just mentioned, it created what's known as I think it's the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Fund.
Yes.
And so it was estimated at the time, because you're going to convert these felonies. And let me just say this background. The difference between a misdemeanor and a felony is that a felony will send you to prison. A misdemeanor will send you to jail, so your local county jail. So that's like the major difference. So when the conversion happened to create these felonies to become misdemeanors, you're reducing the prison population, because now the punishment is a maximum of jail time. So it was estimated at the time of Prop 47 that there would be $150 million to $250 million in savings. That savings was then what was to fund safe schools, the Safe Neighborhoods Fund. 10% of that went to victims, to the victim compensation fund. So if you are a victim of crime, you have to take time off from work, you still need to pay your bills, you can make a claim to that. 25% of that went to schools. It went to the Department of Education to work on our kids. And then 65% of that went to the State Board of, I think it's called Community Corrections. And they have reentry programs, they give out grants, they have training programs. So their whole mission is pretty much to reduce recidivism. So that's one thing that was good. So now if we're looking at what Prop 20 is trying to do, what Christi is talking about when she's like, all this money that went to these great programs to divest from the correctional system and invest into the community is now going to be affected by this legislation if we now drive up the cost of putting more
Before we continue for a second, I know folks wanted to show a brief clip from the No on 20 campaign. So I'd like for Ashley to take us to that real quickly.
While we've been marching for justice, police unions have been plotting Prop 20. Prop 20 would target our communities, wasting tens of millions a year expanding California's prison system, throwing the book at teenagers convicted of petty theft, locking up people suffering from homelessness, and cutting essential rehabilitation and job training programs. Injustice is why we march. Stopping Prop 20 is why we vote. No on 20.
Okay, and we're back. Thank you very much for that. So as we get further into discussion on what Proposition 20 is and the opposition campaign, I want to dive a little deeper into what you had started out talking about, Alana and Christi, about what's the rationale for Prop 20, because like you said, it's like before the ink was even dry on Prop 57 and some of the last series of prison reforms, which were again court ordered in order to reduce the population of prisoners in California. This ballot measure was being filed. So, Christi, I know you've been intimately involved, especially as in terms of helping victims of crime. So, from that perspective, if you could start to talk about not only some of your work, but what you've seen, was probably the impetus for putting this proposition together.
So the author of this and sponsor of Yes on 20 is egregious in some of his behaviors, very well documented. I'll allow for people to do their own research to find out more about the sponsor of this proposition and the face of this proposition. And he is very pro law enforcement. And so what is happening in this divestment that has been happening, as Alana clearly mapped out, is that there has been a shift. So they're more concerned about their jobs and maintaining their status quo in that way, as opposed to protecting and serving the victims that they're supposed, the protect and serve that they're supposed to do. So as someone that has been working very directly with survivors of crime. And let me also just point out, Black women are disproportionately the survivors of crime over and over again, and also the repeat victims of crime. And even in the introduction of this ballot initiative and in this onset, like Alana said, very early on after Prop 47 was passed, there was a press conferences where there were no victims that looked like me or Alana or you. And so I think it's really important to also to point out that this is being used as a scare tactic to kind of like really, make it seem like all these big bad, people of color, Black people are going to come into your house and hunt you down and rape your children, which is some of the things that were said at this press conference. And that's actually, when we think about statistically who survivors and victims are, they're not the people that were at that press conference. They look very much like me and you and Alana. And so as someone that has worked with survivors, it's been very disheartening to see how prevention and how listening to the stories and also the thoughts and also the solutions that survivors have are not anywhere thought about in regards to this legislation. And so for me, it's just really disheartening to see all of the positive gains that have happened. We've been able to see survivors get trauma centers and a lot. I mean, there was like one in San Francisco that was the model trauma recovery center in San Francisco for quite some time. And now there's trauma centers all over the state of California. Like there has been a real investment to make sure that victims, the true victims of crime, are getting the services and the resources that they need. And even still, people are still having problems in regards to getting those services because of the connection with law enforcement. So if you're not in terms of law enforcement cooperating with them or not working with them or giving them the information that they need, oftentimes victims are disqualified for getting services from victims compensation boards. Oftentimes they're not telling them the services that they can even receive. And so we definitely have, I do want to point out, we do have a positive and some advocates in the DA's office that have helped a lot of the survivors that I work with, but that is not a common practice that's happening throughout the state of California. And so I know for a fact that this bill is definitely not listening to survivors. So when you talk to survivors, and there's been a lot of research done, where survivors are not saying we want more prisons, we want everybody locked up. They're talking about prevention, they're talking about rehabilitation, they're talking about service, and they're talking about being able to heal. And that is nowhere in sight in this bill, in this ballot initiative.
Thank you. So if we just focus a little bit more on, on the proposition itself, Alana, I want to ask you, particularly from the positions that you've been in, have you seen reports about rises and increase of crime, or what is it that you've seen from your end that, that might have been like the factual basis for putting this proposition together?
Sure. So I will say that everything that I have seen in our research really has been in the capacity of me as the founder of the Community Justice Collaborative, and not in the context of any other jobs that I might have or work that I have done. So again, just to
good answer, Alana.
Just to go over what the ballots, I mean, if you actually read the proposition, you're going to see that it does 4 simple things. That's what it says it does. One, it's going to limit access to parole programs established for nonviolent offenders. I personally have not seen any data. The last report I looked at was put out by the Public Policy Institute of California, had data from 2018. And although we have had some ups and downs, our crime rate for violent felonies is lower than it was in 2010. It's like at that level. So that it had peaked in some years, but in 2018, we were trending down. So I did not find any data, and I am not aware in the proposition itself where they have cited to trends where people have taken advantage of the early release parole programs, have gone out and increased the number of violent felonies. So the first thing that this ballot is purporting to do is to limit access to those programs. So I haven't seen the data for that. The second thing that this ballot is doing is it's changing the standards and requirements governing parole decisions under this program. So again, that's going back to whether it's state or it's county. I haven't seen any data that would support that as well. Again, I would go back to the Public Policy Institute report. I've also looked at the crime data statistics for the California Department of Justice, and I haven't seen anything that supports the rationale. Again, the third thing that this ballot measure purports to do is authorizes felony charges for specified theft crimes that are currently chargeable as misdemeanors. And I haven't seen that either. And my reading of this shows that if there, I believe it's 3 or more people who are involved in a theft, that would be considered a theft like ring or like a group of like a theft. Yeah. So I mean, you can think of any number of hypotheticals where there might be 3 individuals who are gone into a store, and maybe somebody isn't even aware of it, but just by the sheer number, it could be 5, it could be 10, but they might be, accused of being the lookout or being the distraction. And then also, if you have multiple thefts, then you're
Mhm.
called a serial thief. And as a serial thief, now you will be convicted of a felony. And I haven't seen the data that really supports that. The more people who, just by the number that go into a store or a location or are involved in that means it is some more egregious amount.
Yeah.
And I'm particularly concerned about that in the time economic downturn that we have, or the pandemic that we are now experiencing.
Mhm.
We always want to make sure that you're clearly understanding the facts and that you have like the cultural competency to understand what's going on. And then the fourth thing that this ballot measure does is it requires persons convicted of specified misdemeanors, which again are thefts, and I think some other well, I don't want to misquote, so I'm not going to say what I think it is, but those individuals would be subject to DNA collection. And
Right.
the thinking is that, oh, we're going to be able to solve, more murders and rapes and robberies because we have expanded our DNA database. But I don't
Mhm.
know what the data is that says, that there are people who often commit thefts who are later found to have been murderers or robbers or rapists. Usually from the statistics that I have seen is that people usually escalate in their criminal activity. And so, whereas they might, and then people who commit property crimes, there's not necessarily a correlation to say that it's going to, increase and then jump over to, crimes against a person. So I haven't
Mhm.
seen data with those 4 areas. And one of the things that we focus on at the Community Justice Collaborative is having a human-centered, community-centered, and healing-informed solutions to public safety.
Mhm.
And with the prevalence of DNA evidence, that's something that you have to take very serious, because if there's somebody that's been involved in, let's say, a theft, and they're in the car, and you have a piece of hair that's in that car that fled the scene because, I don't know, maybe one of your braids fell out or something, then it's going to be hard to refute, that DNA. I mean, DNA can tell us the identity of a person, who that hair belongs to, but it doesn't tell us
Yeah.
when it was put there.
Right.
And so, a lot of people, you may have cousins or friends, or you just catching a ride, so it's really hard to refute that if someone presents DNA evidence and say, hey, we got the DNA, you're already in the database. And,
We also know that evidence in that way has been used neglectably and has been used in corruption, right? Like, look at the tests in Detroit. They had found all these rape kits. Like, we can't underestimate some of the things that have happened throughout this country in regards to what it relates to law enforcement. And we also cannot underestimate how much mass incarceration is a booming business. It's a
Yeah. So on
$50 billion business.
on that particular point there, one thing I want to ask and start with you on this, Christi, is, in terms of speaking more specifically about why opposing this measure is important to you, because looking at your background and understanding the groups that you've worked for, the campaigns that you've worked on. Why is this in particular, this movement, and opposing this important to you?
Because of the criminalization that happens in Black and Brown communities, we know for a fact that this is actually going to criminalize people like on the onset. So people are not even given the opportunity to even rehabilitate. We're talking about misdemeanors here. Like, there are times when people make mistakes and people do things, but we're already, categorizing like they're going to be these, violent criminals in the future.
Mhm.
And it's like, you create that narrative, and then that's what happens, and our communities get targeted, and particularly low income communities get targeted, and that becomes a very hard pathway for our young men and young women to navigate. And so I feel like this bill is actually, not only is it trying to turn back the gains that we have actually we've gained in California, because California also has the highest population of people in jails and prison throughout the country, like disproportionately. And then we also we're talking about the fact that it's been a dramatic decrease in how many people have been incarcerated in this state from 2010 to now. And so I can only come to the conclusion, based on the communities that I work with, that they would like for that it's more important to criminalize Black and brown communities than it is to talk about healing and to talk about prevention. And that's what we know to be true, which is why Prop 47 and Prop 57 came into existence in the first place.
Thank you, Alana. On the same question, within the collaborative that you're running and the work you're doing, why is opposing this important to you and the work you're doing? And additionally, it's like you had started to talk about, when you gave some of the history about the different propositions, the different court cases, and the things that have led us now away from, the three strikes era that lasted for many decades into, where we are now. So why is opposing this important for you and the work that you're doing?
Well, I would say that right now, we know that we are at a moment of racial reckoning in this country. And it is undeniable the disparate impacts that the criminal justice system has had on Black and brown communities, and particularly with African Americans, from Reconstruction, Black codes, redlining, lynchings. The policing of Black bodies has always been an issue that we have not fully confronted, all the way up into the 80s and 90s, where you had this tough on crime, lock them up mentality. And we're hearing a lot more of that in the news media from the current administration at the federal level. And so we have to make a decision as to how do we want to move forward. Public safety is absolutely important. Everybody wants to be safe. We want our grandmothers, as Kamala Harris said, we want our grandmothers to be able to walk to the store or be able to go to church and be safe. We all want that. And the solution, time and time again, has not been to lock people up. It is really to look at what is the root of crime and address that, and put resources and time. And so one of the reasons that I think it's important in making the decision, whether or not you're going to support it, but you also have to look at what are you going to achieve. So it's going to cost tens of millions annually. This isn't a one-time cost. We're going to be putting millions of dollars into putting more people in prison, and that's going to be the effect of it. Because if you're convicted of a misdemeanor, of a theft, and you meet that criteria now, it's a felony, that distinction means now you're going to prison. So you're talking about in terms of cost, the
LAO's reported cost of that. I think it was as of 2018, $81,203 to keep someone incarcerated in California.
Yep. So we're not only paying for them to be housed in prison, we have to feed them in prison. They got to have their health care. If they have mental illness, they got to have their medication. And so instead of taking the approach and saying we need to put more resources into that, we need to put more resources into job training. We need to have bills and legislation, or I'm saying bills, legislation, or ballot measures that address that, because that's what's keeping everybody safe. As Christi said before, you see some of the propaganda and some of the videos that's showing, oh, these violent criminals are going to be out, or this crime is not a felony. And so you're focusing on the scare tactic to get back to that lock them up mentality, throw away the key, tough on crime. And that is not keeping everybody safe.
And it did not keep people safe before.
And the reality is, it's one other thing I want to say is where you have more police, you're going to have more policing. Where you have more policing, you're going to have more arrest. So there's a lot of theft crimes. Like, what about wage theft? That's a theft crime. So we're talking about public safety, and we want to keep everybody safe from people who like to steal things. Let's talk about people who steal tens of millions of dollars from people who have worked hard and they don't get paid overtime. Let's talk about other kind of theft, identity theft. where's the policing? Where's the resources on those? Because those people are just as hurt in their community and in their resources in their lives as anybody else.
So I hear you talking about two things, kind of like summarize real quickly, is one, reprioritization of policing, because public safety is important. And in terms of what what we're tasking our law enforcement officers to do. And then secondly is refund the community.
Yes.
So,
well, I would say
you
can say refund the community, but I mean reinvest in the community. And reinvesting is particularly important because we have seen an underinvestment or even an anti-investment in in Black communities, where there hasn't been investment of resources for mental health, job training, resources, just all the time. We're at the bottom of every single list. It's terms of healthcare. Why are our
I have a statistic on that. So with all the cases of COVID we had in our state, it was shocking that California has 128,000 prison beds, but only 75,000 hospital beds. Like, we're underprepared. So we're prepared to lock people up. But when it's time and we're in this pandemic, we were really having an issue. If the pandemic would have hit this state harder than it did, we would have had a really serious issue because we have more prison beds than we have hospital beds. That's not cool. We also know homelessness is one of our state's greatest challenges. But if the state shifted just 1% of the $50 billion spent each year on criminal justice system, it would provide shelter for nearly half of the homeless Californians. The drug addiction epidemic is one of California's greatest challenges. Yet of the nearly 3 million Californians with a substance issue problem, only 10% get treatment. Mental health is a major factor in homelessness and crime. And did you know that in the past 25 years, California has cut the number of beds it has at mental health facilities by 30%. In the last 10 years, California has increased spending on prison by more than $4 billion, even though we have 40,000 fewer people in prison. I mean, it just doesn't add up. So those statistics and that data alone just lets us know that there is not a real logical excuse for what they're trying to do and the rolling back of the advances we've made in this state.
So it brings me to another question, because even though it's the three of us here and so you two out on the front lines really working against this proposition to educate people about it, who else is opposing this? Because I went through and was reading, trying to see who's on what side. What have you guys found who in terms of people or groups who are also out there opposing Proposition 20?
Our last two governors. Governor Brown is one of the biggest opponents to this because he understands, it's not about being tough on crime. It's about being smart on crime to reduce crime. And that's how you achieve public safety. Our current governor, he has plans, I believe now, I can't cite what I read, but I understand that there are plans to close Tracy Dual Vocational Institute, which is a prison, because we don't have a need for it. And that's like a good thing. Like, isn't that great that we don't have as many people who are in prison because they are now becoming productive citizens in society? Like, that's the ultimate goal of what we want to see. We want to live in a safe society for everybody. I don't know specifically for this proposition, but I know, Christi, you can speak to that. Even Newt Gingrich supported, what was that, Prop 47?
Yep.
Yeah, sure. Prop 47, because he is part of a conservative group called Right on Crime, who recognize the era of 3 strikes. And they're like, yeah, you know what? If we're going to be fiscal conservative, we can't maintain a lock 'em up attitude at the same time.
Because we can't incarcerate our way to public safety.
And we can't continue to divest from schools and mental health facilities and not providing resources for people and then think that, okay, they're just, everybody's just going to be okay. Like, no, we actually need prevention. And that's what survivors and victims want. They want prevention. They want to know that no other family has to go through the things that they're going through. And investing into mass incarceration and law enforcement has not shown, like, they don't actually solve crimes. I feel like I got a statistic in some data. I can't remember it quite frankly, but we know, like, I think it's like they solve crimes 40% of the time. Like, okay, like none of these things are actually going to change the experiences that people are having on the ground. And we know that because we actually have lived through 3 strikes and all of the other things that they did in the 80s and the 90s and in some of the 2000s. And so Prop 47, Prop 57 were a correction to the errors that had been made before.
So in terms of that, as you talk about kind of course correction and going things, there was an LA Times article that talked about this, and it really kind of talked about some of the complexities, not just the scare tactics or the new kind of course that we want to go on, but it talked about some of the problems that some of the retailers are having, and those are some of the folks who are supporting this measure. Now, to those folks who are kind of dealing with property crimes and things of that, you've talked some about reprioritizing, refunding the community. What in terms of what you're talking about, and particularly in terms of some of the money that's supposed to be going towards rehabilitation, would help address some of these issues?
Well, we have to go to the root of crime. When you have people who are committing theft crimes, if it's at a grocery store, let's say, a retailer, why are people stealing food? Probably because they're hungry. So if you look at the root causes of what crime is, and there are plenty of studies that say it, but poverty is one, unemployment is another. There are some other statistics of, generational neglect. But if you address those, because what happens is, if that situation persists, and now you've just locked away this person because they stole something from your store, if you still have unemployment, you still have poverty, you still have needs that are not being met in the community, then the next person who is desperate and they don't have any other alternative, they're going to be back in that store. But if you take a more human-centered approach, if you talk to survivors of crime, if you listen to taxpayers who want their tax dollars spent wisely, you're going to say, what is going to be the biggest return on my investment? There was a program in Sacramento County, Advanced Peace, where there was a monetary incentive to stop gang violence or gun violence. And they saw that went down. So there's some results for that because they address the root cause of that situation. And so for the retailers or anyone else who wants to support it, I would say that unless if we're taking a reactive approach, that's not going to help. But if we're taking an approach that gets to the root of the cause of those crimes, then that's a win-win situation for everybody.
And let's just be honest. Mass incarceration is a booming business. It's one of the biggest industries, I'm just going to call it the prison industrial complex. Is one of the biggest industries in the state of California. And some of these businesses actually have been supporters of private prisons. And we have to just reconcile with that as well, that people have had a vested interest in locking people up and keeping them there because it generates more funds for them.
So,
and the changes that have happened have decreased that population. They have even had to try to close some of these private prisons. And so we know that this is an effort, in my opinion, an effort to really generate those funds again. And it's disheartening to think that that's what people are thinking about, is how they can criminalize and incarcerate people so that they can, make money off of them. It's unfortunate. But we know
going off of that, so if we want to talk more about some of the societal, change and thinking, kind of moving away from a lock 'em up to a more holistic view, can you talk, and start with you, Christi, because you've started to touch on that, some of the different programs that you've seen that have actually been helpful for folks in terms of rehabilitation, in terms of getting them back on the right track, and going specifically to what Alana was saying about, addressing the root causes, of crime.
Well, I'll go into the ACEs. We always talk about childhood traumas and how that is actually a root cause of even your life expectancy, right? So that whole initiative with Prop 47 and Safer Schools and Communities was really to make sure that schools were getting the resources that they need in regards to, trauma recovery services, and being able to have counselors and have some of the essential things that they need, because young people are experiencing crime and violence as well. I think when we think about healthcare, and when we think about incarcerating people, and how that even affects people that go to prison and not being able to get adequate health care, and also being low income. We know being a low income person in this country also means that you get disproportionate care. Even as a Black woman, having a child, and as someone that's middle class and college educated, you have the outcomes of our white counterparts that are low income and also smoking cigarettes while they're pregnant. We have the same birth outcomes. So we know there's some health disparities in that. We also know mental health services, like mental health. And like I stated earlier, for the last 25 years, there's been a divestment from mental health services. They closed the doors in the 1970s, and there has never been any vested interest in making sure that mental health services have increased over the years. Addiction treatment, like 10% of people get treatment for addiction. Like, that's ridiculous. And then if you want to talk about the crack era, that was a horrible era that we didn't even, Black and Brown communities didn't get half the resources that are kind of going, and that they're discussing and talking about with this opioid epidemic that is happening now.
Yeah.
And then affordable housing and jobs. Like, these are the things that survivors are talking about. These are the things that they want to see more of an investment in. And as a taxpayer, we want to see our money being put in a place where we can actually benefit from it. We shouldn't have to be putting all of our money into a system of law enforcement that doesn't even actually prevent us from crime or solve the crime.
So this next question, I want to go to you, Alana. From your group and your position, can you talk a little bit, and you've started to already, about some of the costs that would be incurred if this proposition were to pass, not just in terms of, and I think kind of two ways, the kind of actual hard costs in terms of funding things, and then what's going to be then defunded, especially as we're talking about, reprioritizing and refunding efforts.
So just focusing on the facts, and if you went to the ballot measure, the fiscal statement included in that ballot measure states that it would be increased costs to state and local corrections departments. So those are correctional costs that would be in tens of millions of dollars annually. And that's from the proponents of this. So obviously, those who are opposing it, they probably would have higher estimates, but it's increased state and local correctional costs in the tens of millions. And that's a cost associated with county jail populations and the level of community supervision that's going to increase. The second fiscal impact is going to be increased state and local court-related costs that could even be more millions annually, because you're going to have more arrests, you're going to have felonies. Felonies require a preliminary hearing. So it's just more court procedures that are involved with that. And the third fiscal impact is going to be increased state and local law enforcement costs. And that's probably going to be at least a few million by the estimates in the fiscal statement related to collecting and processing DNA samples. So you're going to have tons of people. And remember, we reduced the prison population by like 30,000, and that achieved the savings. So if you are increasing the prison population, which I have heard some of the proponents to say, this is not going to increase the prison population, that is a flat out lie. But, the same thing when we did, the crime bill, we always look back on this and like, oh man, that was a really bad decision. It is going to, if you just use common sense and say, hey, you're going to have more arrests of felonies, that's going to result in higher prison costs. So now we're taking away money from the Safe Neighborhood and Schools Act, which is going again to that victim compensation fund. It's going to the State Board of Community Corrections Fund, and it's going to the Department of Education. So that's the real impact that we're going to see.
Can I also add that?
Yeah, please go ahead, because I was going to ask you the same thing.
Yeah, because I also want us to also think about how policy and legislation functions, right? If you've been fighting the bill for the last the 6 years that it's been in existence, how can we actually come to a firm decision and conclusion about the effectiveness of it? Like, there is no data, and I feel like that's something that we really need to focus on. There is actually no data, any statistics or information to support.
So in some ways, it's like, I think an apt analogy would be that after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, there were school districts, in states that were still fighting it until about 1971.
Correct.
So
it's the same kind of thing, and it's like it goes back, this pendulum that goes back and forth. And I feel like citizens of this state are tired of the back and forth, right? We want to see prevention. We don't want to see mass incarceration. It doesn't actually make us safer. It actually does more harm. And we want to see positive change in our communities. I talk to survivors, and as a survivor myself, our biggest thing is that we don't want any other family or person to have to deal with the trauma and the violence and the crime that we've had to deal with.
And the other thing is, let's not lose sight of the fact that we're in a pandemic. We're all three of us are lucky because we have a job, we have a house, and we have our health. But there are people right now, had it had not been for the executive order of the governor, are facing eviction. They have not been able to pay their rent for months. And guess what? When the moratorium is lifted, they're still going to be responsible for that. So when people don't have a job, when they may not have a house to live in, this is where we want to put resources. We have
I think it's a waste of money.
We have such a great need with people's health, their housing, and their employment right now. If we're talking about wanting to make people safe or just having a human-centered design to policy, as Christi just mentioned, in general, we need to look at those more pressing needs and address that.
Right.
So we are actually coming up on our hour. This has kind of flown by really quickly. So I'd like to thank you guys for that. First of all, because of the back and forth, and this is important, and hopefully folks who've been watching have picked up some additional information to help them either make their decision or to dig a little deeper into what they may have been thinking before. So with that, and before we bring Brianna on to lead us out with a close, I'd like to start with you, Christi, if you could give us, a minute in your kind of closing thoughts, because you've talked about a lot of things, and, as you go through, if you could, I'll just let you kind of program that.
So kind of talk about some of the things that I'm championing and leading on. Is that what you're saying?
Please. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So there is a campaign called Heal the Vote. And we really want survivors to make a commitment to actually vote in this election. Like, we need survivors to be at the center of these policies and the legislation that they're proposing. We need our people who are particularly survivors, people that have had to navigate some of the most traumatic things in their lives. We need them to be a part of Heal the Vote. Okay, so please go to #HealTheVote and please sign and say that you are making a commitment to vote. That's number one. Number two, there's another campaign called Progress, Not Prisons. It actually talks about the work that is happening to actually continue and to build on Prop 47 and Prop 57, because those things have been effective. And if we continue to allow them to do what they're supposed to do without the opposition, I believe that we will get the results that we're looking for in our community. And lastly, I am, again, the founder of the Sacramento Sister Circle, and the Sacramento Sister Circle, with the leadership of Dr. Flojan Kofer, she was one of your guests last week, and a committed group of other Black women, professional, brilliant, Black girl magic all the way around. We have done voter guide, and we've been doing this since 2012. So we've been providing a voter guide that actually goes in depth in every election that is going to be on this ballot. But what we do is we provide education and facts and information so people can make informed decisions. We want people to know the information. We don't want people to have to guess. We want to help them with that. And we have taken a lot of time and energy, and we've been doing this, like I said, since 2012 to make sure that folks can actually get the information they need. So that voter guide will be available on October the 3rd on our website, which is www.sacramentosistercircle.com. And that will be available October 3rd on our website. And we're having a voter guide launch party on October the 8th. We have the honor of having Dr. Assembly Member Shirley Webb. She's going to be giving remarks. And so on October 8th, we're going to actually have a launch party for our voter guide that will go into depth. People can ask us questions and again, hear from some of the esteemed folks working in the legislature and policy arenas to talk about why it's important to vote and why we recommended the people that we did.
Thank you very much. And Alana?
Thank you. So Christi talked about healing the vote and progress, not prisons. My organization, the Community Justice Collaborative, is about healing the community, and it's looking about progress as we look at solutions for public safety. So one of the things that the Community Justice Collaborative is trying to do is that we are looking at meaningful reform and progressive solutions to restore public trust and address the disproportionate impacts on Black and Brown communities of our current policies. So we are focused on human-centered, community-centered, and healing-informed solutions. And so you can go to www.communityjustice.us for us, communityjustice.us for more information. And we start off by, asking the community what it is that they need. And we try to be responsive to that because public safety is not something for certain communities. It's public safety for everything. It's public safety for everybody. So when we're looking at solutions, we're looking at solutions that are trying to keep everybody safe. So we have monthly community legal clinics that are absolutely free, and we bring in experts and they will talk about topics to help inform and empower members of the community. And we're also working on some other initiatives that are coming up. So I just want to remind people that the power does lie with the people. And even though you have this proposition that's on the ballot, it's within your power to make that decision. And so we need public safety solutions of the people, from the people, and by the people. So when you go to the ballot, you can be informed and make the right decision. But my organization is one of the organizations that is going to work on what do we do after the November election, and what are we going to do to create public safety solutions that include everybody from here on out.
Thank you very much. Christi Ketchum, Alana Mathews. Right now, I'd like to bring on from the SAC Change Coalition, Ms. Brianna Mullen, with a few words about your ballot and voting and putting a plan together. Brianna?
Thanks, Khaim, and thank you, Alana and Christi, again, for all of your work, on Prop 47, for the community, for Sacramento, for really what we're trying to do here with the Sacramento Change Coalition, which is try and make community safety something, like Alana said, that is available to everyone. And the most important thing that you can do in the next couple of weeks is have a plan to vote. And so what we want to remind you, just before we close out this event, is that every registered voter will receive a vote by mail at home. If you, for some reason, don't receive your ballot at home, or if you lose your ballot, you can always do a conditional voter registration, or what's called a same-day registration, and submit a provisional ballot at any voter center in the entire state. You can also turn in your ballot at any voter center in the entire state. Your ballot this year will already have a stamp on it. So you can put your ballot straight in the mail. You can drop it off at any of the ballot drop boxes that you see, or you can hand it in person at a voting center if you want to make sure it's done. If you want to sign it off to someone, just make sure that you've checked your signature and that it matches. If you've never voted by mail before, you may want to consider re-registering to vote if you've changed addresses, If you've changed your name, you may want to consider re-registering so that all that information is up to date so that you can make sure that your ballot is counted this November. If you want to make sure that you're tracking your ballot, you can go to where'smyballot.sos.ca.gov, or you can go to Ballot Tracks online. You can get text messages. I just signed up yesterday to get text messages so that when I put my ballot in the mail, I'll be able to know exactly when it gets to the voter reg center and when it's counted. It's really important this year that with so many people voting by mail that we're really diligent about making sure that your information is up to date. Remember that you can return your ballot to any polling place, any voting center, or your county elections office by 8 p.m. on November 3rd, and it'll have 7 days after that to get counted. So many counties will have early voting locations before Election Day. In Sacramento County, we're going to have election polling places open for 10 days. And, just to remember once again that you want to double check your address. You want to double check your signature on the return envelope and compare it with the one that you provided when you registered to vote. So I know that a lot of folks are going to be voting by mail for the first time this election. And if you haven't done it before, you just want to make sure that your signature matches and that your voice is heard this election day. So if you have any questions about how to vote or how to get your ballot or how to get any more information, please let us know. There's lots of different local organizations, grassroots organizations, including ours, that are trying to make sure that we can really get out the vote this November and take action on these important criminal justice propositions.
Thank you very much, Brianna. And I would like to thank everyone from the SAC Change Coalition for putting together another voter town hall to give people a chance to hear and learn and gather some information about some of the things that are going to be on this ballot. I'm Khaim Moton, and thank you again for joining us.